History of Autism and Asperger's Syndrome in the 1600s. Autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and Asperger's syndrome, now subsumed under ASD in modern diagnostics since 2013, are 20th century concepts with no formal recognition or terminology in the 1600s. The term autism was first coined in 1911 by Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler to describe symptoms associated with schizophrenia, while Asperger's syndrome was outlined in 1944 by Austrian pediatrician Hans Asperger to characterize a subset of autistic traits without intellectual disability. Thus, there is no direct history of these conditions in the 17th century, as they were not diagnosed, studied, or named. Instead, historical analysis relies on retrospective speculation, where modern scholars examine accounts of behaviors that align with contemporary ASD traits, such as social withdrawal, intense focus, repetitive interests, or sensory sensitivities. This approach is controversial, as it imposes modern medical frameworks on eras without psychological diagnostics, potentially leading to anachronistic interpretations. Behaviors now linked to autism might have been attributed to madness, simplicity, idiocy, or even divine inspiration, depending on cultural and religious contexts. Were there people in the 1600s who had Asperger's syndrome or autism? Yes, it is reasonable to assume that individuals with autistic traits existed in the 1600s, as ASD is a neurodevelopmental condition with genetic and environmental roots that predates modern society. Evidence suggests such traits have been present in human populations for tens of thousands of years, potentially aiding survival in prehistoric contexts through skills like pattern recognition or detailed memorization. However, without diagnostic tools or frameworks, these people were not identified as autistic. Retrospective diagnoses, speculative assessments based on biographies, letters, and contemporary observations, are common but debated. Opponents argue they legitimize autism as a timeless human variation, raising awareness and countering myths that it's a modern epidemic. Critics highlight impossibilities. Accurate ASD diagnosis requires direct interaction, childhood history, and standardized assessments, which historical records rarely provide fully. Such efforts can perpetuate stereotypes, e.g. autism as a genius disorder in white males, and overlook everyday autistic lives, focusing instead on elites. A prominent example from the era is Isaac Newton, 1643–1727, the English physicist and mathematician. Scholars like Simon Baron Cohen have speculated Newton exhibited Asperger's-like traits, including profound concentration, e.g., becoming so absorbed in work he neglected meals or social norms, social detachment, eccentricities noted by contemporaries, and repetitive behaviors in his alchemical pursuits. Evidence draws from biographies describing his isolation and intense focus, but this is contested. Some attribute his behaviors to the era's intellectual demands or personal traumas, not neurology. Other speculated figures, e.g., from lists of historical autistics, like Michelangelo, 1475–1564, predate the 1600s, while later ones like Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, fall into the 18th century. No widespread records exist of ordinary autistic individuals, who might have been integrated as artisans, herders, or scholars if their traits proved useful, or marginalized if they hindered social functioning. Protestant and Catholic writers' views regarding the happenings of the 1600s. The query's phrasing is somewhat ambiguous, but interpreting it as inquiring about Protestant and Catholic writers' perspectives on 17th-century events, particularly in relation to disability, madness, or behaviors akin to autism, reveals a landscape shaped by the Reformation's aftermath. The 1600s were marked by religious wars, scientific revolutions, and shifting views on human difference, with writers often framing madness, a catch-all for intellectual or behavioral deviations, through theological lenses. Protestant views. Protestant writers, influenced by Reformation ideals of individual reason and scripture, increasingly challenged supernatural explanations for madness or disability, viewing them as medical issues or tests of faith rather than demonic possession. In colonial America, starting in the 1600s, Protestant responses emphasized community charity and moral duty, with figures like Cotton Mather writing on mental afflictions as divine trials to be met with prayer and care, though harsh treatments like institutionalization emerged later. Quakers, a Protestant sect, advocated gentle, humane approaches, founding retreats like the York Retreat in the late 1700s, rooted in Christian compassion. Writers like John Locke, 1632–1704, a Protestant philosopher, discussed idiocy in empiricist terms, influencing views of intellectual differences as natural variations rather than sins. Catholic views. Catholic writers often retained medieval influences, seeing madness as potentially linked to sin, possession or divine will, but emphasized charitable care through church institutions. In Counter-Reformation Europe, figures like Saint Ignatius of Loyola's followers promoted spiritual healing, with madness sometimes treated via exorcism or pilgrimage. However, the era's scientific shifts, e.g. via Catholic scholars like Galileo, began decoupling disability from pure theology. Overall, both traditions viewed happenings like plagues or wars as divine judgments, but disabilities were increasingly seen as opportunities for charity rather than punishment. Clergy from both sides played roles in care, perceiving madness in terms of good-evil, with treatments blending spiritual and emerging medical approaches. These views were not monolithic. The scientific revolution, e.g. Newton's era, prompted both Protestant and Catholic intellectuals to explore rational explanations, reducing stigma around eccentric behaviors. How 17th-century society handled autism or Asperger's syndrome. Without specific labels, 17th-century societies, primarily in Europe and colonies, handled autism-like behaviors under broader categories like madness, folly, or natural idiocy. Treatment was informal and varied by class, region and severity, with no specialized interventions. High-functioning individuals might go unnoticed or even thrive in roles valuing focus, e.g., scholars, artisans, or herders, while severe cases faced marginalization. Community and family integration. Most lived at home or in communities, supported by kin or parish. Poor relief if destitute and unable to work. Traits like literal thinking or pattern recognition could be assets in trades, e.g., navigation, craftsmanship, leading to acceptance if productive. In nomadic or rural groups, such as Sami herders, contemporary analogs, these skills aided survival without labeling. Institutional and harsh measures. Emerging asylums like Bedlam in London housed the mad, but these were for extreme cases, often involving chaining or public display for entertainment. High-functioning autistics might avoid this, but non-conformity could lead to prison, exile, or accusations of witchcraft possession, especially during religious upheavals. Religious and charitable responses. Handling was a Christian duty, with parishes providing aid and clergy offering spiritual guidance. By the late 1600s, views shifted toward restorability through reason, paving the way for humane reforms, though life remained brutal for many. In summary, 17th-century handling prioritized utility and charity over diagnosis, with integration possible for adaptive traits, but hardship for others.